Sophie Jose is going to present the data, the big data project that AMMF has funded over the last few years. It's been a labour of love, but here at last the hard data that Helen's been seeking for some years to basically up the profile of cholangiocarcinoma and let the world know what we're dealing with. So we're really looking forward to this. Thank you very much, Sophie.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really happy to be back here again to talk about the cholangiocarcinoma data project. And I'm doing this on behalf of all my colleagues listed on the slide who have made huge contributions and been involved in this work over the last number of years. Okay, so as most people attending this conference will know, cholangiocarcinoma is quite often asymptomatic in early disease, and as a result, most people will present quite late and get diagnosed at a late stage of disease. And this leaves them with quite limited treatment options. And as a result, outcomes for people with cholangiocarcinoma generally are quite poor. And if it's hoped to improve the situation and improve outcomes, data are needed in order to evidence the current situation, to improve understanding of this disease, and to highlight where variation exists. However, when we're thinking about a UK setting, data that are available can be quite limited or have limitations, often coming from countries outside of the UK, who will have different populations and different healthcare systems, importantly. Or they may come from small or single centre studies, which again can have quite selected populations. Or where there is national data available, it's not quite detailed enough for cholangiocarcinoma to assess variation. So with all this being known, AMMF have instigated the cholangiocarcinoma data project to provide the evidence base from a national cohort of individuals with cholangiocarcinoma that can be used to then make the case for improvements in the management and outcomes of this disease. So the data project focused on different elements of the cancer pathway with the aim of understanding whether there was any regional, socioeconomic or temporal variation. And the parts of the cancer pathway that were focused on included the incidence of the disease, which were measured as age standardized rates. We looked at routes to diagnosis, which can be categorized as emergency presentation, which is generally associated with late presentation, a 2-week wait urgent GP referral, which is generally associated with earlier presentation and a more managed pathway to diagnosis. Other types of GP referral and other routes that can include being diagnosed as an inpatient or an outpatient or only on the death certificate. We've also looked at proportions who are treated with potentially curative surgery and those who received any systemic therapy or a stent insertion in the 12 to 15 months following diagnosis. And finally, we have looked at mortality, which again was assessed as age standardized rates. So we did this using data that were collated by the National Disease Registration Service that is now at NHS England. And this included the National Cancer Registration Dataset and Systemic Anti-Cancer Therapy datasets. And we also had available other linked health data sources, so hospital episode statistics and mortality statistics. And this enabled us to define a cholangiocarcinoma cohort for all of England using the data available. And for this cohort, we had patient and tumour characteristics available, such as those listed on the slide. So we had age, gender, and deprivation scores, comorbidities, details about the tumour itself. And then cancer alliance of residents at diagnosis was our measure of geography for our geographic variation analyses. And incidence and mortality we assessed from 2001 to 2017. Routes to diagnosis we could assess from 2006 to 2017. And treatment we could assess from 2014 to 2017. And this was according to the availability of the data items needed. Okay, so given that the starting point for this analysis was to improve understanding of the disease, now we've come to the end of the project, we'd be quite keen to see how our expert audience perception of cholangiocarcinoma matches up with what we found through the course of the project. So to this end, in this presentation, there will be a live poll and Q&A that we'd love for you to complete as we go through. You can do this and take part either by going on your phone or laptop to menti.com and entering the code on the slide, or you can scan the QR code on this slide, or I think there are QR codes on the tables as well. And I think for our virtual attendees, there is a direct link attached to this presentation that you can click. Okay, so assuming I can manage the tech, we will give this a go. So our first question then is, what is the age-standardised incidence rate of cholangiocarcinoma in the population in England for the most recent time point we assessed? Okay, and we can see some answers coming in already. This is very exciting. I will give a few seconds for some answers to drop in, and I will start a 10-second countdown. I know there's quite a few attendees online, so hopefully we'll start to get a few more responses in. But was the incidence 0.5 per 100,000, 2.5 per 100,000, or 4.5 per 100,000 people in the population in England? 5 seconds. Okay, right. Yes, so the 28% of people who voted were correct. The incidence rate, or age-standardised incidence rate of cholangiocarcinoma in the population was 4.5 per 100,000 people. Sorry, I'm trying to monitor both slides at the same time. So yeah, over the period 2001 to 2017, we saw nearly 30,000 cholangiocarcinomas diagnosed in England. And the incidence rate of the disease, as others have mentioned, did increase over this period. And we can see this on the slide compared to other biliary tract cancers, and that the increase was more marked for cholangiocarcinoma. We also saw that this incidence was associated with deprivation. So those who were more deprived had a higher incidence rate of cholangiocarcinoma. Okay, so on to our next question. What was the age-standardised mortality rate of cholangiocarcinoma in the population at the most recent time point assessed? Okay, was it 1.8 per 100,000 people in the population, 3.4 per 100,000 people in the population, or 4.8 per 100,000 people in the population? Okay. Some votes rapidly coming in. I'll start a countdown. So 10 more seconds then to cast your vote. Okay, so unfortunately the majority were not correct in this situation. So the age-standardised mortality rate of cholangiocarcinoma in England is actually 4.8 per 100,000 population. And again, this mortality rate has kept pace and kept parallel with incidence over time and has increased between 2001 and 2017. And again, as compared to other biliary tract cancers, there is a more marked increase in mortality, as this wasn't seen for the other biliary tract cancers. Again, mortality was higher with increasing deprivation, and those who were most deprived had the highest mortality rates due to cholangiocarcinoma. Okay, so on to our next question. What proportion of cholangiocarcinomas were diagnosed in those aged below 65? Okay, was this 12%, 22%, or 32%? It's a clear majority for this one, which is interesting. Okay, so we actually found 22% of cholangiocarcinomas were diagnosed aged younger than 65 in our cohort. So yeah, but CCA does not only occur at older age, and we did find that males on average had a younger age at diagnosis than females. Okay, so what proportion of cholangiocarcinomas were diagnosed via an emergency route? Was it 25%, 40%, or 50%? Opinion changed quite quickly then. I'll give a final few seconds to submit your answers. But a split crowd on this one, it seems. Okay. But yes, the right answer did win out. So half of patients diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma were diagnosed via emergency presentation. We did see that the proportion diagnosed via emergency presentation decreased over the time period from 51% down to 46%. But as you can see, it is by far the most common route to diagnosis for cholangiocarcinoma. And to put this into context, where for all cancers combined in England, the proportions diagnosed via emergency presentation over the same period started at 25% and decreased to 20%. In terms of the 2-week wait urgent GP referrals, the proportion diagnosed via this route encouragingly doubled from 10% up to 20%. So we looked at geographic variation in the proportions diagnosed via 2-week wait and emergency presentation route. And the graphs on the slide are funnel plots that show cancer alliances. So each dot on those graphs is a cancer alliance and how they vary from the population average, which is represented by the dark horizontal black line. And the dashed lines there are the significance thresholds. So cancer alliances lying above the upper dashed lines or below the lower dashed lines are significantly varying from the population average. And we can see that for both routes, there is both higher than average and lower than average proportions diagnosed across all cancer alliances in England. Okay, so final question then. What proportion of cholangiocarcinomas were treated with potentially curative surgery within 12 months of diagnosis? Okay, was this 12%, 22%, or 32%? Again, we have quite a definitive answer on this one, it seems. I'll start the countdown for the last few votes to be cast. Okay, and yes, that was correct. 12% of cholangiocarcinomas were treated with potentially curative surgery within 12 months of diagnosis. And this was either in isolation or in combination with systemic therapy or stent. There were a further 18% who received some systemic therapy, 25% received stent insertion, and there was a group of 5% received both chemotherapy and stent insertion in the middle. But our possibly most surprising finding was that half of the cohort, we couldn't find any evidence of either surgery, systemic therapy, or stent insertion. The reasons for this aren't quite clear. Unfortunately, we did have quite high levels of missing information on both stage and performance status. It makes it quite difficult to see what the clinical characteristics of those were that didn't receive treatment. But we did see quite high mortality in this group in the 6 months following diagnosis, which may be a contributing factor. So looking at geographic variation in the probability of potentially curative surgery, we did see some significant variation from the population average, and there's 2 cancer alliances there that had lower proportions receiving curative surgery. And then amongst those who didn't receive any potentially curative surgery, we looked again at geographic variation for the proportions that received systemic therapy or a stent insertion in the 15 months following diagnosis. And again, whilst there is some variation in systemic therapy, there was much wider variation in the proportions that received stent insertion, both in the number of cancer alliances that were outside of those significance thresholds, but also in the absolute deviation from the population average. So you can see this ranges from below to above 15% away from the average. So to summarise, the cholangiocarcinoma data project has evidenced increasing incidence of cholangiocarcinoma, strong associations with deprivation and a younger age profile in men than in women. Whilst encouragingly 2-week wait diagnostic routes have increased over time, emergency presentation is still by far the most common route to diagnosis for cholangiocarcinoma and is higher than for all cancers combined in England. But the geographic and temporal variation in the diagnosis routes suggests there's opportunities for sharing of good practice across organisations to continue and improve on the recent trends that have been seen. And we saw that the increasing mortality due to cholangiocarcinoma is paralleling incidence and shows mortality hasn't improved for cholangiocarcinoma over time. And this just emphasises how important it is to achieve improvements in the diagnosis and management of this disease. A high proportion of patients weren't treated with surgery, systemic therapy or stent insertion that we could find evidence of, and extremely high short-term mortality in those that didn't receive treatment suggests that this is a contributing factor to this finding. The large geographic variation in the probability of stent insertion could be evidence of differences in clinical practice, but we are aware that a stent insertion isn't going to be indicated for all cholangiocarcinoma patients, so this could be explained by differences in clinical case mix that we weren't able to account for in the analysis. So local detailed review of treatment pathways and a more comprehensive guidelines for the management of cholangiocarcinoma could help to reduce any potential variation in the treatments received across regions. So in terms of what's been happening since the work was undertaken, so as Helen mentioned, we've got manuscripts that have been submitted for publication to disseminate these findings further. We have been sharing learning and what we found on how we define cholangiocarcinoma within the cancer registration dataset. And this is going to be informing some routine reporting as part of the Get Data Out programme. That means we're going to have information specifically on cholangiocarcinoma in terms of the incidence and then hopefully treatment and outcomes on a regular basis going forward that can help us monitor the changing dynamics of this disease over time going forwards. And now AMMF have this data, they can use it to inform their discussions around improving outcomes and reducing variation in care for cholangiocarcinoma. Thank you for your participation in the poll. That was really interesting, and thank you for listening. Cheers.